Welcome to Raising OKC Kids Conversations with Metro Family. We will be releasing a series of select interviews curated from our National Parenting Summit that feature topics especially relevant to you, our podcast listeners. These interviews initially aired in early 2022 when the pandemic was still very top of mind for parents. While that time in our lives will always be a monumental reference point, these interviews and the information they provide stand the test of time. We hope you enjoy. I'm co-host Kirsten Holder from Metro Family Magazine, and I am happy to introduce our next guest, Hunter Clarke-Fields, here to talk to us about how to be a calmer, more grounded parent. And who doesn't want that? Thank you so much for joining us today, Hunter.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'd love to start by sharing a little bit more information about Hunter. She is the creator of the Mindful Parenting course, host of the Mindful Mama podcast, and author of the best-selling book, Raising Good Humans, a mindful guide to breaking the cycle of reactive parenting and raising kind and confident kids. She helps parents bring more calm and peace into their daily lives. Hunter has more than 20 years of experience in meditation practices and has taught mindfulness to thousands worldwide. She is the mother of two active daughters who challenge her every day to hone her craft. So I know you're in it with us when we're hearing your advice today. Hunter, you famously start each of your podcast episodes with a phrase that I think is so impactful. You cannot give what you do not have. When you have calm and peace within, and then you can give it to your children. I'd love to hear more about what inspired you to create this mantra as a theme for your work as an author and a content creator, and just more about your personal journey through mindfulness as it relates to parenting.
Sure. I mean, I think that this work all really stems from me being really bad at parenting. I was like failing big time. I was struggling and I was frustrated. And I got into this, into the relationship with my first daughter, and she was pretty intense. She was she's highly sensitive, the way I'm also highly sensitive. So, go figure. But um, as she started walking and talking into those toddler years and just this resistance, and she was so sensitive, and I discovered my temper, a really big, badass temper coming up, arising within me. And it was the exact opposite of what I wanted. And so I realized, that this is for me, this had to be either, I couldn't stay on the floor just like crying and guilt and misery forever. Like I had to take this challenge. I had to take this and make this challenge my teacher and see what I had to learn from this. And so the idea of, you can't have, we put that calm and peace, we practice that calm and peace within ourselves in order to then give it to others. We cannot give what we do not have, is just truth. You can't, if you don't have it within, you can't give it. We go into the parent-child relationship sometimes thinking that, and this is like a story that culture feeds us, that like parenting is going to like fill every hole in us, and that it's going to make us feel complete and all of these things. And the truth is, we're this same person after parenting, but we have now a huge responsibility and a lot of like stressors, a lot of challenges, and a lot of stuff coming up, and often without a lot of support. So I think when I think about what I want for my kids and what we want for our kids, right? Like we want them to have like a happy childhood. We want them to be, I want them to have a peaceful childhood. I want them to be able to grow and flourish on their own and follow their own, be able to just whatever was in them, whatever the flower was in them, I wanted it to be able to grow and blossom in a beautiful way without like huge difficulties and traumas to be in their way. And to me, that meant peace, right? Like peace is that sort of highest value for me, like contentment, peace within. And and to be able to give that to my daughter, and that's what I wanted for her. That's what I wanted her. I wanted her to be able to be comfortable in her own skin, to have moments of feeling grounded, peaceful, a part of the universe, just comfortable as her place in the universe. And I realized I really needed to give that to myself, because in those moments I was ungrounded. I was not peaceful. I was agitated. I couldn't settle. And so how was I going to give it to her? How was I going to be that for her? Because our emotions are contagious, right? Like, you have a toddler, that they feel you, right? They feel your feelings. So we can't just focus on our kids and say, I'm going to give them everything, but I'm going to hate myself. I'm going to be mean to myself. I'm never going to give myself any time, because it just doesn't work that way. The best thing we can give to our kids is a really healthy, grounded, um, peaceful caregiver. That's really the best thing we can give to them. And then that flower of who they are can grow and flourish. And so, yes, you cannot give what you do not have. And this is borne out by like the research with Brene Brown and more. It just really is true. What is inside is what comes out. And that may seem damning, like if you had, like, I had a temper, I had like some ugliness inside, but what we can make change. And that's the opportunity, and that to look at this very clearly and say, oh, I've got some things inside that I'm not crazy about that are coming out. To look at that clearly and say, okay, these things can be my teacher. Then we can start to say, okay, what can I do to make change?
Oh my goodness, so many things of what you just said I want to pull out, but I think the overarching that giving the gift of peace to your kids is such, I mean, that is such a gift. And basically what you're describing is modeling, and why modeling is so important, because you do it yourself first and then you give it to others. And I just love that model, for lack of better terminology. And speaking of personal journeys, you often talk a lot about generational cycles and how they affect our parenting. You talked about your own experience with having a temper, and I don't know a single parent on the face of the earth that has not struggled with anger, especially when we have all these triggers and stressors like you were describing, but especially when we have generational cycles of anger and temper. So I'd love to hear from you. Why do we need to understand generational cycles, and how can we as parents in this generation be cycle breakers?
It's such an important conversation, because the default if we don't do anything is we repeat the generational patterns. That's generally the default, and that's borne out by the research, that if you don't you don't understand, you don't take steps to like heal or transform any hurts, you will pass them on. What you don't transform, you transmit. And I could really see that in myself. So, and it was so interesting, because in that time I was yelling at my daughter. I could see I scared her. It was heartbreaking, but at the same time I could see, oh, like when she gets upset, it feels unacceptable in my body. It feels like this is unacceptable, like just viscerally. And I realized I had that feeling in my body because when I was little and I had those big upset feelings, my father's temper came out and he yelled at me and scared me. And so I got the message loud and clear that this was unacceptable. And so on. Like my father spanked me. His parents, they used a belt on him, which is, we consider that child abuse now. And then it was in the 1950s or 60s, that was normal. But if we don't start to like look at that and understand it, we just repeat that because it sort of plants this seed in us. And I could see that I'm repeating this behavior because of the way it feels in me. And so because I had never really understood that before, like, why would I want to repeat the exact thing I didn't like, right? And so the first thing we have to understand about these generational cycles is that, we probably will pass them on if we don't do anything about it. But then the second thing to understand is that when we can look at things clearly, when we start to understand things, when we can, and that's part of what mindfulness helps us do, is to be able to see clearly. So when we can start to say, oh, this isn't this temper, this isn't something I chose. I wasn't like, please, I would like to yell at my child and scare her. Nobody does that. Nobody chooses a temper. So we're so harsh on ourselves. We blame ourselves, but it's just something that's conditioned in us. And it's part of our biological wiring as well, our nervous system. We're primed to be on the alert for threats. And so the blaming ourselves doesn't help. But looking at these things and saying, oh, okay, looking at these things without judgment, instead looking at it with this attitude of curiosity, right? This is the mindfulness attitude of non-judgment, of curiosity, and saying, oh, what is here? How can I understand this? And then as you understand it, then you can, when you understand something fully, then you can start to tease it apart. And then you can say, oh, hello, hello, temper. Hello, feeling of not being seen and heard. Oh, hello there. I see you. And you can start to then take the steps, the bit by bit steps it takes to start to transform that and start to take care of those feelings. I mean, it's not our fault. Most of us were taught like, just don't have those feelings, right?
Mm,
Especially women, we're taught like, don't be angry. Like, gosh, God
right.
forbid you're an angry woman, right? So when things come out in us like aggression and temper and anger, it's like this whole shame storm happens. But the truth is, temper and anger and aggression, it's part of being a human being. It's part of being the human anger animal. And when we can say, okay, we can accept that, the paradoxical thing is, once we start to look at it, we start to understand it, start to accept it, then we can work with it, then we can transform it, and then we can start to practice ways to move that energy through our bodies in healthier ways. Then we can say, okay, right now is not a good time. I need to take a break. I'm gonna hide myself in the bathroom or I'm gonna like go, and we can start to we can start to take responsibility for it when we can acknowledge it, and understand it and accept that this is just part of being human.
Absolutely. And it is part of being human. I love even that you mentioned appropriate, what maybe society or other deems as appropriate feelings for women too, and especially moms. And we're already in our shame cycle. We're already putting guilt on our shoulders. And so who needs that on top of everything else? I really appreciate those tips. And speaking of yelling, I like that. I think it's interesting that you were recalling when you were yelled at as a child, and what you remember from that is just being scared. And sometimes, anger gets our energy flow out as parents, but it's not always the most effective for kids in changing long-term habits and behaviors. So I'd love to hear from you more about that. How do we stop yelling, especially when we grew up in a household where our parents were yellers? And why isn't it effective in the long run?
It's such an important question. And I think sometimes a better way to talk about it is like, how can we yell less? Because the truth is, we're going to be human and we're going to yell sometimes. And that's not the end of the world for our kids. But it isn't a healthy thing to be doing all the time. We do want to reduce our yelling as much as we possibly can, because what happens when we yell, even if, we're not doing like a physical abuse like spanking or something, but if we're yelling, what happens for kids is that their nervous system fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. They're scared. They're not learning anything in that moment. It may appear on the outside that it like quote unquote works, but really what's happening is they're going to take flight, they're going to run away, they're going to psychologically run away, they're going to take, or they're going to fight back, or they're going to freeze, right? They're going to freeze in a protective moment. But the nervous system, it's really interesting because what's happening in the nervous system is similar for both parent and adult, in that for the child, their nervous system feels under threat. They go into fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens in that moment for both parent and child is that the parts of the brain responsible for fight, flight, or freeze, which are kind of in the brainstem, they actually bypass the slower parts of the brain, which include the prefrontal cortex, which is this area like right behind our forehead. And the prefrontal cortex is the area, it's all very interconnected, but is basically the area responsible for executive function, problem solving, higher order thinking, verbal ability, empathy, all of these things are slower than like, yikes, get out of the road, right? Like we don't even have it. And so the threat response bypasses that so we can react automatically. And so when we yell, our kids' threat response is like going crazy. So they're not even accessing their whole brain. They can't learn in that moment because they're getting flooded with fear. For us, we are actually yelling because our threat response has been activated. Our stress response has been activated. Something about our kids' behavior has has led our nervous system to register that as a threat. And we know what stress feels like, right? The stress response. We know like the tight jaw, shoulders tense, tight hit, the breathing becomes faster, heart rate is faster, it moves away from digestion. That response, when we're in that response, when we're starting to get to losing it, and then we lose it and we yell, what's happening is our threat response is bypassing this thoughtful part of our brain once again, and it's it's acting to we're acting in a protective manner because this situation feels like a threat. So it's once again, it's not your fault, right? Like it's not you didn't choose it. No one said I would like to be a yeller. I'm going to really freak out my kids and scare them, going to harm our relationship. No, nobody wants to do that. But this is what's happening. And in the law, and it creates a disconnection. So our kids can't learn. It can kind of damage the relationship. The research shows long-term harsh verbal yelling can have the same negative effects as things like spanking, with like increased drug abuse, increased antisocial behavior, all that stuff down the line. But more immediately, it makes it so our kids don't really want to cooperate with us, right? Because the connection that we have between us, that's what makes our kids want to cooperate with us, want to meet our needs, right? And vice versa. When we're yelling, when we're scaring them, we're creating disconnection, right? We're making it so they're less likely to want to cooperate with us over the long term. And then they start to just tune you out anyway. You become the want Charlie Brown parents. And the problem is you have to yell louder and louder. The threats have to get worse and worse. It feels like the go-to sometimes because that's what was for us, like that's what we're conditioned for. And also our nervous system is like prone to the stress response, but it over the long term, it really, really can harm our relationship. I mean, I know, at least for myself, my relationship with my father was harmed it took me, for decades for a decade at least after I left home, like we had a really strained relationship because of his tactics when I was a kid. And I think a lot of us in this generation, we don't want that, right? We want something better.
Absolutely. I think every generation wants better than what we had. And hopefully that'll make the next generation even that much better. So I do appreciate your tips on yelling there. I'd also love to dive further into this by talking specifically about tantrums. Speaking of yelling, which of course can happen at any age, not just in toddlerhood, which is what I'm firmly in right now. Tantrums of any kind are almost a surefire way to hit all of our buttons and flag all of our signals. But how can we stay calm and respond rather than react? And what do our kids need from us when they are experiencing those big feelings? How do we both meet our needs and what they need as well?
Well, we can talk about tantrums in like the ideal way first, right? Like that can be nice to sort of like think about. And then we can get real because the truth is you are like being like triggered and your stress response and all that. But like ideally what our kids need from us is, in an ideal world, and trust me, kids don't need everything to be ideal all the time. But in an ideal world, if they're having a tantrum, it's like an emotional, like they're in overwhelm. They're having a brainstorm, right? They can't handle life at this moment for whatever reason, and they feel out of control. And so ideally from us, they can't listen to us. They can't learn in that moment. But ideally from us, they need maybe an adult to help them feel safe and just witness. So if you ideally you might be able to kind of just stay in the room and say, "I'm here when you need me, bud." And you sit and you breathe. Breathe like you're a calm, solid mountain. And you just practice to take care of your own feelings so that you can be grounded and you can let your child eventually borrow your calm when they're ready for it, right? Like that's our ideal situation. Realistically, also, and so that's great when we can get there. That's awesome. And we're going to get there sometimes. I know it for sure. You listening, you're going to get there sometimes. I know it. But also, there are times where like this yelling and tantrum over something that matters so much to your kids doesn't matter at all to you, and you're frustrated by it. You just need to get going. You are likely to have a lot of things going in your life, and you're likely to feel stress and lose it yourself. And and how do we deal with that? So, one of the things you can do, um, as we sort of get down this path, you want to be able to take care of your feelings, right? So if you're if you're like, "Oh, Hunter and Kirsten said I should stay in the room when my child is having a tantrum. I should be there for them." And you try to be there for them, but you're like, ah, you're about to lose it. It's actually better to just take a break. "Babe, you're really upset. I'll be right back. I got to take a moment to breathe. I need a break. I'll come back." And so you go and you take a break and you use some tools to move your body in from the fight, flight, or freeze response into the rest and relax response. That can include taking deep breaths. It's cliche because it works. And they're actually doing studies with Marines in active duty where they teach them to breathe 6 super slow, deep breaths. And it's bringing their whole brain back online, reducing their stress response, helping them be able to put their attention where they need to, where they choose to, rather than freak out. So deep breaths do work because it's kind of forcing your body into that rest and relax response. You might sigh, like, there's some research that like the more dramatic and loud the sigh is, the better it is for just releasing stress and energy. You might put a hand on your heart. Soothing touch helps, even if it's your own soothing touch. You might say to yourself, "I am safe. I'm safe. I'm helping my child. Right now I'm safe. I'm helping my child," right? You want to tell your nervous system you're safe because your nervous system feels unsafe. Then you want to move into that mode of "I'm not threatened, I'm helping," right? So you might even shake it out, like shake your limbs. Like after a zebra gets chased by a lion on the savannah, they go and they like their whole body shakes, and they're shaking out the energy of the tightened muscles and the stress response, right? That is moving energy out to the limbs. So we have to understand our biology, right? Like understand that we're an animal on earth that has these responses, and we have to take this energy, we have to move it somewhere. So we can work with this biology and lower that stress response. So it's the same thing for sort of how to stop yelling. Um, and ideally, and then you go back to your child and maybe you practice those deep, slow breaths with your child. You say, "Hey, babe, I'm here for you if you need them." You just keep your child safe for a tantrum. That's basically all you need to do is you keep them safe. Maybe you're there for them. But if you find yourself, say like you find yourself, we talked about yelling, you're kind of like in a moment, you're on the road to yelling. Instead of saying to yourself, maybe your child's being irritable, frustrating you, instead of saying to yourself, "I'm going to stay calm because Hunter said to be calm. I'm calm. I'm calm. I'm calm. I'm calm." And you're fake calm, right? And you're just trying really hard. It's beautiful. Like you're trying really hard, but it's not actually authentic. And it's actually much better in those moments to say, I name what you're feeling. "I am feeling really irritated right now." You can even say it out loud. "I'm feeling really frustrated. I'm starting to get frustrated. I'm starting to get irritated. I need a break." And when you do that, that's brilliant. It's like a brilliant parenting move because it's a 2-for-1 deal. You're taking care of your own feelings so that you can be more regulated, so you can use your whole brain, right? Remember how we get the brain sort of bypassed in stress response. But also, you're modeling for your child healthy emotional regulation. You're modeling emotional intelligence for them. They're learning what we didn't learn. They're learning how to move through an emotion, how to regulate, our feelings so we don't behave with others in a way that's unhealthy.
Oh my goodness. Oh, again, so many things that you just mentioned I want to pull out. I love the visual though of this energy inside of us, whether it's our anger and temper, whether it's our irritability, frustration. It has to go somewhere. So where are we going to put it? And we're almost talking to our inner child. When you said the soothing touch, even if it's your own, soothing yourself just as you would your child models how to self-soothe. I mean,
Yes.
it's just a cyclical thing, and I just love all of these tips and the visuals that you put with it, with the lion and the zebra. I know that's a very dramatic maybe representation of what we might be feeling, but sometimes it feels like that. Sometimes it feels like we are
Yeah.
just pushed to our limits, and that energy again has to go somewhere. So where are we going to put it, and how are we going to get it out, and how are we going to teach our kids to get it out too?
Yes. Yeah. And this is our biology. This is just how we're wired. Like, this is just part of being a human animal here on earth, is having a nervous system that was wired for this from the moment you were born to keep you safe, because it's the most important thing to be able to respond to the threat. So when we understand that, then we can say, okay, I don't need to blame myself. It's not willpower. It's not like a choice. It's not about my character. It's
Mhm.
about my nervous system.
Yes, and when we can frame it like that, we can think more clearly too, which we need desperately in those situations. That's so helpful. I love the way that you've talked about temper throughout this, and I know it will keep coming up, but I want to talk a little bit more about how the temper is not your fault. And you often say in your podcast, but it is your responsibility to tame your temper. We've
Mhm.
spoken a little bit about this already, but do you have any extra tips on how we can take care of ourselves as parents first, and then model for our kids also what it looks like to tame our temper?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we understand that all those things we talked about, the biology, the causes and conditions of our childhood, we also know now that trauma gets passed on physically through, with in our DNA and our genes and our gene expression. Um, so those responses that you have, they're not about your character, they're not about your person, they're not a failing, they're not a sin, they're not something wrong with you that isn't there in every other person. You're not alone. This is how we are all wired. And so when we can start to say, we can start to then offer ourselves some forgiveness, right? I think that's part of offering ourselves this understanding and acceptance and forgiveness. This, to say to ourselves, I forgive you for your mistakes, right? When I we can forgive ourselves for our mistakes, then we can begin anew. And this is an important part of taming your temper and showing up for your kids, is that to be able to show up for our kids, to be there for our kids, we want to be grounded, we want to be able to be relatively stress free, we want to be able to be clear of, not always in the future, anticipating the future. We want to, not always be doing and achieving and going and judging. And to do that, it takes some, because those are sort of like the human defaults, right? To like always be in the future and to judge and to go and to do. It takes a little practice, but when we when we can do those things, we can say, okay, I I forgive myself, I'm healing myself. When we can do that stuff, it's very much a 2-for-1 deal, because then when we practice stopping that judgment for ourselves and practicing more curiosity for ourselves, we get into the habit of that. We can start to say, then extend that curiosity and lack of judgment to our kids. We can say, I wonder why you crazy toddler are doing this thing? What need are you trying to meet right now? Like, I'm instead of just like, no, this has to stop. What's going on here? This is so weird. Why are they painting, drawing, making their nose like bright blue with their marker or whatever it is? Like, what's happening here? What need are they trying to meet? So then when we extend do these healing practices for ourselves, when we learn to regulate our emotions, when we learn to lower our reactivity, all that work for ourselves, we're trained to think that that the ideal mother is like selfless. The ideal person is selfless and always puts others first. And I hate that because it's not true. It doesn't work that way. The person who always puts others first is burnt out and resentful ultimately. I mean, that's really what happens is true. I think that happened with anyway, we'll talk about my extended family later, but it's it's true. Like, that's what happens when we are always putting others first. And when we really instead understand that to be able to use my whole brain, to be able to give my child what they really need, which is, and the research also shows this, our presence, our ability to really see them, really hear them, really accept them without being in going, doing, achieving, judging mode, then when that's what they need from us, and when we can when we can give that to ourselves, that takes a little bit of time, it takes a little bit of practice, it takes a little bit of learning, it takes a little bit of effort, but when we can do that, that's the very, very best thing we could possibly give our kids. Because if we don't, then we're reactive, we're not using our whole brain, we're not, you know what I mean, we're giving our kids the second or third rate version of ourselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you spoke some of those affirmations at the very beginning. I know some of the what you talked about in the previous question applies here too, but it's so hard to think of those affirmations on our own, especially when we're in full stress mode. So I appreciate you speaking those into both myself, but everyone listening. We need that all the time because parents are not perfect, and we certainly aren't without our own mess up moments, as we've clearly defined so far. Things we wish we wouldn't have said, or ways we could have rephrased things to be more constructive. It's definitely a journey, and I believe it's more important for our kids to see us quote unquote fail and then recover. I'd love to hear from you. What is the best way to apologize to our kids, and how should we talk about apologies at each age and stage?
You're right. We're never going to be perfect, right? And you're right. Like, they do need to see us fail. There's a psychoanalyst therapist in the 50s, D.W. Winnicott, who talked about the idea of good enough mother or good enough parent, and really saw that, like, as parents, he saw that observing thousands and thousands of mothers and babies, he saw that inevitably, like, we fail to meet their needs in certain ways. Like, we don't hear them cry, or we don't, whatever, we don't get a message. And those are actually, that's part of life. And that's actually good, because our kids need to develop some resilience. If we had every need met all the time, they would be unable to go into life, right? So the very best we can do is good enough. And parenting, it truly is. There's no perfection, and that's hard for us to hear as a really achievement oriented, culture, right? Like, I could, like, get the good grades and get we get the job, we get the graduate school or whatever, we're doing the things, and it's hard for us to understand that we're going to mess up. But you're right. Our kids do need to see us fail. They need to see us make mistakes. And so we don't have to, like, manufacture that. That's going to happen. That's okay. And when we do, that process of repair is so important. I mean, honestly, a relationship can become stronger after repair, after some kind of disruption, and then a repair, than if there never was a disruption at all in the first place. Because when we repair, we say, we just say, I'm sorry. I wish I hadn't said that way. I scared you and I'm sorry and I'm going to try to do better. We can just be human with our kids and let them know. And this is vulnerability instead of defensiveness, right? We're
Mhm.
opening up that defensive cage around us. And it's really the best way to teach our kids to apologize is to just apologize to them when we need to. We don't need to make anyone apologize. Really, we could say, "Hey, when you're ready, an apology would be the right thing to do." That might be a good thing to say, but the best thing to do is to model and just say, "I'm sorry." Our relationship with our kid is a relationship, just like our relationship with our parenting partner or anyone else's. And that relationship takes some work. It takes some deposits. We need to maybe go out on some dates and have all these, we want to have positive deposits before we withdraw, right, from this relationship bank account. And and just like in any relationship, you would say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I'd like to do that over. I wish I hadn't done that. And we need to do that, especially with our kids, because if when we don't go around and talk about a difficult, challenging conflict afterwards, our kids will make up all kinds of things in their heads. Their kids are famous for blaming themselves. They'll blame themselves. They'll tell themselves a story of nefarious things maybe you were thinking. We have to just be real and honest, just like in any relationship.
Absolutely. It's hard for us to think about that being a relationship when you're talking to a pint-sized person or older, and you're trying to model the way and show the way. But thinking about it as a two-way street is really, I feel, the most constructive way to build that connection long term.
There's a someone who talked about this once, and I love the way she talked about it. She said, rather than role to role, we should think of our relationship with our kids as soul to soul. Like
Mm,
they're just a small, immature soul. And rather than being in the role, like, you don't talk about yourself in the third person. Mommy is this, mommy is that. Be you. It's okay to be you.
mm,
And it's okay for you to have needs. It's okay for you to have boundaries
mhm.
and to have those needs met. And but it's good to just be you, soul to soul, rather than role to role.
I love that. That's going to be one that sticks in my mind for sure. Hunter, we are coming to the end of our talk today. And to close out, I'd love to leave our listeners with your top piece of advice. You've left us so many good nuggets here, and I know I'm going to be rewatching this several times and taking notes, but I'd love to hear from you what the one thing is that you hope parents walk away learning and implementing after this interview. What would be that one thing for you?
I mean, I think it is that you have to live what you want your kids to learn. Your modeling is 80% of parenting. You have to live what you want your kids to learn. So if you what you give to yourself, whether you give yourself time, support, positive practices, learning, all of that directly benefits your child. It's much more important than any kind of uh, games, toys, sports, vacations. It's so much, and it pays dividends down the line. And I think that you know we don't we tell ourselves a story that we should just be able to do this and it just should be extinction, it's instinctual and all that. But I think that when we give ourselves those things to heal, to grow, to become to live what we want our kids to learn, then that really is it. I couldn't have thought of a better way to spend my time when my daughter was young, because now she's going to turn 15 next week. And we have a good relationship. It was going to be a bad relationship. It was going down a bad path when I was young, when I was a young mom. And now it's really positive and strong. And that was the best thing I could have done with that time.
I love that you even spoke to using yourself as an example, how you quote unquote failed and recovered for our listeners. I mean, again, we're not perfect and we need to know that we can recover and we can go back to the place that we always wanted to be with a little bit of work and help. So I really appreciate your time today.
Can I add one thing?
Of
I think
course.
what I want to add to that is Just remember, what you practice grows stronger.
Mhm. Absolutely. Just as kids, they need practice to grow skills, and we do too as parents. Most of us have never done this before. So we do need all the practice and help we can get. I appreciate you giving us that grace and allowance, and really giving us some good tips here. I so appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Hunter. For those of you wanting more, find Hunter at Mindful Mama Mentor on most any social media platform, or through her website, www.mindfulmamamentor.com. Thank you so much to our listeners for joining us.